Altidore, Mitroglou, Van Wolfswinkel. The Premier League has been home to some truly dreadful centre-forwards. They say that scoring goals is the hardest job on a football pitch, and Victor Anichebe would surely have to agree. In 204 games playing as a striker in the Premier League for Everton, Sunderland and West Brom, Anichebe scored 26 goals, which is fewer goals than Gary Cahill. Even Joleon Lescott scored 23. Following that needlessly violent introduction where I attacked 4 unwitting Premier League forwards for absolutely no good reason and gave them no right to respond, though, let's face it, their response would probably fall some way wide of the mark even if I had tried, in today's video, which is the latest in this series, taking a look at the Premier League's greatest players, we turn our attention to some of the finest forwards ever to have graced the Premier League. In case you are new to the series, this is the penultimate positional 7 of the series, following videos already taking a look at the 7 greatest goalkeepers, right-backs, centre-backs, left-backs, defensive midfielders, attacking midfielders, right-wingers, and left-wingers of the Premier League era. The criteria is simple: the quality and quantity of a player's performances in the Premier League. Jurgen Klinsmann, for example, was a much better striker than Emil Heskey, and his peak in the Premier League was better than the Englishman ever produced in English football's top flight. However, Klinsmann only ever played 1.5 seasons of Premier League football, meanwhile Heskey has played more Premier League games than any other forward. So I would still call Heskey a greater Premier League striker, if not a better one. Conversely, Jermaine Defoe played a lot more Premier League games than Luis Suarez, and even scored more goals, but Suarez still made more than 100 appearances in the Premier League, and was so good that I would still call him a greater Premier League forward than Defoe. It is a balancing act, you see, and I will explain some of my decisions and provide a comprehensive countdown of all of my honourable mentions at the end, by which stage you will all either hate me or consider me an idiot, or indeed both, based upon my 7. Without further ado then, who once trained with Manchester United but never actually played in the Premier League, here are, in my view, and in my view only, the 7 greatest strikers of the Premier League era. 7th, Eric Cantona. The early parts of this 7 I found to be the most difficult to settle upon, but in the end, there was just no way that I could leave Eric Cantona out. The Frenchman didn't play an awful lot of Premier League football in the context of this 7, just 156 games over the course of 5.5 seasons, and he didn't score all that many goals, again, compared to some of the other players in this 7, bagging 70 goals over the course of those 156 games in total. But Cantona's impact upon the Premier League and his influence upon the English game makes him one of the Premier League's greatest ever players regardless. Cantona first arrived in English football 6 months before the breakaway of the Premier League in January 1992, when he joined Leeds United from Nîmes, initially only on loan for a fee of £100,000. It was £100,000 that would win Leeds United the First Division title, thanks primarily to the partnership that Cantona forged alongside Lee Chapman. For all of his talent though, Cantona was often considered to be a troublemaker at Leeds, particularly after they signed him on a permanent basis in the summer of 1992. So just a few months later, when Manchester United came calling after their new signing Dion Dublin broke his leg, Leeds willingly accepted a bid of £1 million, the same amount that they had paid for him. Manchester United were a club on the rise under Alex Ferguson at the time, but they still hadn't won the league championship since 1967. The Red Devils had been down in 10th following a poor start to the campaign, winning only 5 of their opening 15 games. But Cantona came in and immediately lifted the mood. It is no secret that the Frenchman had a real aura about him, both on and off the pitch. And he also had a tremendous work ethic that he brought to training sessions. Cantona may not be the most prolific forward in this 7, indeed, he often played almost as a number 10, but few Premier League players have scored as many truly crucial goals as him. Manchester United won 4 Premier League titles during Cantona's less than 5 seasons at the club, before he hung up his boots, aged only 30. It is impossible to say with any certainty whether Manchester United would still have become the dominant force in English football over the next couple of decades without Eric Cantona. But Alex Ferguson has gone on the record as saying that he believes there are no guarantees that they would have done, so Cantona quite rightly gets us started. 6th, Dennis Bergkamp. The two least prolific strikers or centre-forwards in this 7 feature in 6th and 7th place in my 7, as Dennis Bergkamp sneaks in narrowly ahead of Eric Cantona. Bergkamp spent a lot longer in the Premier League and played a little over twice as many games as the Frenchman, which is a large part of why he takes 6th. Signed by Arsenal from Inter Milan in 1995, upon his arrival in North London, Bergkamp reportedly became the highest paid player in the Premier League, and he tripled what had been Arsenal's existing club record transfer fee. Following 3 outstanding seasons at Ajax, where he scored goals for fun, Bergkamp had bagged just 4 goals in all competitions in his last season in Milan. That didn't trouble Arsenal though, who saw Bergkamp as the perfect foil for Ian Wright. That proved to be a wise decision, and after Arsene Wenger arrived at Highbury in 1996, Bergkamp reached yet new heights. A year after Ian Wright left Arsenal, Thierry Henry arrived, and Bergkamp managed to form, if anything, an even more impressive partnership with the Frenchman. Simply one of the most gifted players to have ever graced the Premier League, Bergkamp's touch, awareness, and his weight of pass elevated the English game, along with the rest of that brilliant Arsenal team. In total, Bergkamp scored 87 goals and made 94 assists in the Premier League over exactly 10 years in England. But beyond the numbers, he was just one of the most gifted and consequential overseas players that the Premier League has seen. 5th, Harry Kane. The only current Premier League player in this 7, and I apologise if that is too much of a spoiler and you were expecting to see Cenk Tosun feature later on. It is quite possible that by the time Harry Kane hangs up his boots, or just bids farewell to the Premier League at least, he will have climbed another few places up this 7. As of 2022 though, I think 5th sits just right for the Tottenham man. Kane is already the 5th highest scorer of the Premier League era, so there is some pleasing symmetry with his ranking there, having recently overtaken both Frank Lampard and Thierry Henry. At this point, it seems inevitable that Kane will eventually become at least the 2nd highest scorer of the Premier League era at some stage. It is just a question of whether he will ever leapfrog Alan Shearer into top spot. It is taken as a given that Kane has scored that many goals now, but it is no less remarkable, and nor is the fact that he will most likely become England's all-time record goal scorer before he turns 30. Unlike a lot of great Premier League strikers, whether that be Michael Owen or Ruud van Nistelrooy, it wasn't immediately obvious that Kane was destined for stardom the first time most of us saw him play. Between England's under-21s and various loan moves, I must have watched Kane 20 times before he broke through at Tottenham due to a lack of forward options. And at no point during that time did I think that his eventual breakthrough seemed totally inevitable. Kane is not the quickest, nor is he the most naturally gifted, but he does have fantastic attacking movement, he can strike a ball cleanly and accurately with either foot, he's good in the air, and over the last few years, he has been as impressive as a provider of goals as he has been scorer of them. Above all else though, it is Kane's mentality that makes him so special as a player. He is relentless, whether that be in training, in terms of his self-belief, or just not letting the size of the occasion or any missed chances during a game go to his head. Unlike every other player in this 7, Kane has never won a Premier League title, or any major trophy for that matter, but that doesn't stop him from being the 5th greatest striker of the Premier League era already, at the age of only 28, as far as I'm concerned. 4th, Sergio Aguero. Sergio Aguero ranks 1 place ahead of Harry Kane in the Premier League era scoring charts, and he also ranks 1 place ahead of him in my 7. Aguero scored 184 goals in 275 Premier League games for Manchester City, which is an extraordinary record, especially given that he didn't play a full 90 minutes in a lot of those games. On a minutes per goal basis, Aguero is the single most prolific player of the Premier League era, and by some distance might I add, with Mohamed Salah recently having overtaken Thierry Henry as his closest competitor on that front. Aguero's start to life in the Premier League got off to a bang, as he scored a brace off the bench against what had been, up to that point, a resilient newly promoted Swansea City team, including a real thunderbolt from range. It was no secret that Aguero was a special talent from his time in Argentina and in Madrid, but if there were any doubts about his ability to transfer that form over to the Premier League, they were pretty quickly extinguished. Following Pep Guardiola's arrival at Manchester City, at which point there was a bit of speculation about Aguero's future at the club, the Argentine became much more physical, much more industrious, and far more involved in Man City's build-up play. At his best, which, personally, I think, was probably the 2017-18 season, Aguero was an absolute animal. His strength, for someone who is only 5'8", was phenomenal. He could hold the ball up, bring others into the game, and he was still scoring almost a goal a game. Aguero seemed to pick up a niggling injury or two almost every season, which just prevented him from hitting truly ridiculous 30-plus league goal tallies a season, and perhaps from finishing even higher in this 7. But the fourth greatest striker of the Premier League era, off the back of 9 seasons in England, well, it isn't bad going, is it? Third, Wayne Rooney. I think that there is a real debate to be had between Sergio Aguero and Wayne Rooney when it comes to the Premier League's greatest strikers, and it was one that I gave some real consideration. On the Aguero side of the argument, you have the fact that he was very much an out-and-out centre-forward throughout all of his time in the Premier League. He was much more prolific than Rooney and much more consistent in terms of his overall output. On the other hand, Rooney played considerably more games in the Premier League, 216 more to be specific. He was more complete than Aguero, even Aguero in that 2017-18 season, and you could argue that the only reason Rooney wasn't as prolific as the Argentine, and arguably the only reason he didn't score even more goals in the Premier League than Alan Shearer, is because he was always either drawn or instructed to come deep, drift out wide, and get involved with the game at all times, rather than just scoring goals. It gets forgotten now, but even though Wayne Rooney is a year younger than Cristiano Ronaldo, back in 2004, when Rooney linked up with Ronaldo at Manchester United, he was way ahead of Ronaldo in terms of his talent and contribution. The way that Wayne Rooney performed at Euro 2004 as an 18-year-old was absolutely mind-blowing, and had certain external factors been different, I think Rooney could comfortably have gone down in the same bracket as Messi and Ronaldo. Whilst he did not manage that, he still had an extraordinary career. In the Premier League alone, Rooney scored 208 goals and made 103 assists in 491 appearances. At his most prolific, in the 2009-10 season, Rooney scored 26 goals in 32 Premier League games, but he was never content with just being a number 9. Rooney's decline, if you like, had already begun by the time he was 28, and he left the Premier League at 32 in a move to the MLS. Had he maintained his pre-2014 level into his mid-30s, Rooney might have troubled top spot, but given how early he broke through, he has still done more than enough to merit a bronze medal in this 7. Second, Alan Shearer. Realistically, even if it was just based solely upon the number of goals that he scored, Alan Shearer could only finish either second or first in this 7. Shearer is of course the highest goal scorer of the Premier League era, on 260 goals, and he ranks 5th in English football's all-time top-flight scoring charts with 283 goals. That is because 23 of Shearer's top-flight goals, all of which were scored at Southampton, came before the creation of the Premier League in 1992. It was in 1992 that Shearer left Southampton, joining free-spending Blackburn Rovers under the ownership of Jack Walker and the management of Kenny Dalglish. It was at Blackburn that Shearer won his only Premier League title in 1995, during his most prolific, and indeed one of the Premier League's most prolific campaigns, as the Englishman bagged 34 goals in 42 Premier League games. In 1996, when Shearer was probably at the peak of his powers, he had the choice of joining Manchester United or Newcastle United. From a footballing perspective, Manchester United were the obvious choice, as the emerging force within the English game. But Shearer was a Newcastle fan, so he decided to join his boyhood club for a world record £15 million. Over the next 9 years, Shearer became Newcastle's leading peacetime goalscorer, bagging 206 goals in 405 games. Often described as an old-school British centre-forward, given his strength, aerial ability, and his willingness to put his head in where it hurts, do not be fooled into thinking that Shearer couldn't play a bit as well. Brilliant at holding the ball up and bringing others into the game, it was his ability to score every type of goal, left foot, right foot, bullet headers, scruffy finishes, tap-ins, screamers, free kicks and penalties, you name it, Shearer could put it in the back of the net. And only the unique va-va-voom of the man up next can restrict the Premier League's greatest goalscorer to a spot in second. First, Peter Crouch. Not just the tallest, but also the best, Peter Crouch is the leading scorer of headed goals. Nah, I'm just messing with you. First, Thierry Henry. I might have given it away a bit with that va-va-voom reference there. For those of you who remember that advert and aren't just wondering why Alfie is quoting from a Nicki Minaj song whilst talking about Alan Shearer, but I suspect that even without any spoilers, once I named Alan Shearer in second, most of you knew who was going to take gold. For my money, narrowly ahead of Roy Keane, Thierry Henry is not just the greatest forward of the Premier League era, but also the greatest player in any position. Henry was brought to the Premier League in 1999 by Arsene Wenger, who had worked with a teenage Henry at Monaco. He joined Arsenal off the back of just 7 months at Juventus, where Henry had struggled to get to grips with life in Serie A, only managing to score 3 goals in 20 outings and even being deputised as a left wing-back. Henry had always been a left winger in fairness, for both Monaco and France, but it was at Arsenal that Arsene Wenger made him the Gunners' central striker. Henry would always drift out left for Arsenal, to particularly devastating effect once his compatriot Robert Pires joined the club, but his move central proved to be a masterstroke. In his debut campaign, Henry scored 17 goals in the Premier League and 26 in all competitions. In the 2002-03 season, Henry not only scored 24 Premier League goals, he also made a record-breaking 20 league assists from 37 outings, the latter of which has since been matched once by Kevin De Bruyne, but never exceeded. The following season, Henry, in what is widely regarded as having been his magnum opus, scored 30 goals in the league alone, as Arsenal went invincible in the Premier League. In total, Henry scored 175 goals and made 74 assists in 258 Premier League games, winning the Golden Boot 4 times, making the Premier League Team of the Season 6 times, and making the PFA Team of the Century. Beyond the numbers though, Henry was also just the most feared and iconic player that the Premier League has ever seen when he was at his absolute best. For the best part of a decade, when Premier League defenders went to sleep at night, they had nightmares where all they saw were those long sleeves and gloves. When you saw that iconic combination, it was pretty much game over before a ball had even been kicked. Henry was lightning quick, incredibly skillful, and effortlessly inventive in terms of both his dribbling, passing, and finishing. His backheel goal for Arsenal against Charlton Athletic, whilst far from being his most impressive goal for the club, was indicative of that invention and confidence that he had in his own game. There are lots of different ways that I could justify Henry topping this 7, but ultimately, I just think that he is the greatest centre-forward of the Premier League era. So those are my top 7, but I promised you some brief explanations and honourable mentions, and we start with Luis Suarez. At his peak, Suarez was as good as anyone in this 7. I would argue even Henry. And if I were ranking the best Premier League strikers or the best seasons by Premier League strikers, he would take either first or second place. Ultimately though, as I alluded to in the introduction, Suarez simply played too few games, spent too few seasons, and, by virtue of that, just lacked the weight of Premier League greatness to feature ahead of either Dennis Bergkamp or Eric Cantona. The striker who actually came closest to making my 7, based on the stated criteria of quality and quantity of performances in the Premier League that we have used throughout this series, was Andy Cole. And I was really disappointed that I couldn't find a place for him because I don't think that he gets anywhere near the credit that he deserves when people talk about all-time Premier League greats. And now I feel like I am part of the problem. Were this channel called HITC 8s, he would definitely have featured. Behind Andy Cole, if I were to make a top 10, it would be Liverpool duo Robbie Fowler and Michael Owen, who would complete that list. Both were teenage superstars who shot to immediate stardom, Fowler arguably the finest finisher that the Premier League has ever seen, and Owen basically brilliant at everything before he suffered the first of many hamstring injuries at the age of only 19. Were it not for that first injury, and all those that followed, Owen could well have been as good as anyone in this seven. And the fact that he still achieved what he did in the Premier League, despite being plagued by injuries and spending time at Real Madrid, meant that he very nearly featured. Elsewhere, honourable mentions are owed to Ruud van Nistelrooy, Robin van Persie, Carlos Tevez, Dimitar Berbatov, Ian Wright, Teddy Sheringham, Jamie Vardy, Dwight York, Nicolas Anelka, Fernando Torres, Jermaine Defoe, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, Mark Viduka, Emil Heskey, Robbie Keane, Kevin Phillips, Romelu Lukaku, Peter Crouch, Dion Dublin, Darren Bent, Yakubu, and Didier Drogba, among others, and not in that order of course. Drogba, again, was as unplayable, if not even more so, than anyone in my seven when he was at his dominant best. But he only had 2 truly rip-roaring Premier League seasons, and whilst his big game credentials are undeniable, all those sensational final performances are irrelevant to this seven, which is concerned only with the Premier League. So that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Abuse is always welcome, even death threats. And make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens, so you can stay up to date with this series and all of the other unbelievably sensational content that I produce. It is amazing that one man can come up with all of this sheer genius, as some people would call it. You can also find me on social media on either Twitter or Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.